Good morning to everyone. That was our Pavlovian bell time to start Bible class. Glad to have all of you with us this morning, whether you're joining us here in the auditorium or whether you're joining us online, whether you're visiting with us or whether you're enjoying the series that we've been studying through the book of Genesis. We studied the first month, we took and we read through the book of Genesis, and we took some lessons out of that. As we're studying this series, we're doing, though, Genesis in the New Testament, and Genesis as the foundation of our faith. And what can we learn from that as we study the New Testament, and how can we grow from that? We're finishing up the Gospels today. We're taking a look at the book of John, and as well as his writings. There's not as much in his later letters, so we're going to look at those as looking at the apostle whom Jesus loved, as he refers to himself. It's quite different in character from the other three synoptic gospels. It's highly literary. It's more symbolic as he writes it, because he writes it, as he says at the end of the gospel. He wrote it so that we might believe that Jesus was the Christ. He didn't write it as a history book. He didn't write it as here's the things that were happening. He wrote enough that people would believe. He wrote enough so that people would be able to put away some of the false doctrines that were going around at the time. It was a very theological reflection as they were going through this. It was probably written at the end, near the end of the first century. John was one of the last living apostle, if not the last. And so as he was writing this, he had seen the church develop over that first century. And as he's writing this, he's writing to them to encourage them. He's writing them to put away some of those false doctrines. Some of those false doctrines include the Gnostics, who believed that it would not be possible for Christ to be both fully divine and fully human. He was writing to them to believe, to put away some of those things of the past with some of their Jewish festivals, and say that Christ is better than this. Here's why Christ is a better version of this. We're not going to get into those today, but some of the things that Genesis talks about why. And how he uses Genesis to support this is why Christ is both fully divine and fully human at the same time. Jesus was when we talked about these three lessons we've done now, Matthew and Mark, we looked at together, and it talked about how Jesus was the only beloved Son of God, and he used the book of Genesis to demonstrate original purpose and how God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And then Luke used the book of Genesis to demonstrate that Abraham was a blessing to the entire world through the seed of Jesus. That it wasn't just for the seed of Abraham, but he was also a blessing to the Gentiles. And how could that blessing come through Jesus and be a blessing to the entire world? Today, what we're going to be looking at in John and 1 John is that Jesus is the Son of God, and he was with God in the beginning, and he is God in himself. And that's a hard concept to wrap around. That God can be both fully human, or Jesus can be both fully human and fully divine, and be God at the same time that he is the Son of God. And be with God in the very beginning. But we're going to take a look at that and see how did John use the book of Genesis to support that. So first thing we're going to look at is some of those straightforward references and how he builds those arguments as we're looking at this. First reference that we're going to look at is in John chapter 4, verses beginning in verse 5. Jesus comes he has to go through, and he decides, normally the Jews would skirt around Samaria, but he decides to go through Samaria. And he has a reason for it. He doesn't want to avoid the Samaritans. He wants to specifically have this interaction with them. He stops at the well while the disciples go into food, and he has this interaction with a Samaritan woman. And in verse 5, it says, he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well, and it was about noon. So there's one thing that's an easy reference back to Genesis. It's the location of the city Sychar near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. So it's specifically referencing back to a situation that we see in Genesis, where in Genesis chapter... Turn over there. Genesis chapter 48, the dying Jacob says to his son Joseph, in Genesis 48:22, he says, "And to you I give one more ridge of land than to your brothers, the ridge I took from the Amorites with my sword and my bow." And so as he's referencing, he doesn't give us the specific location of this well back in Genesis, but he is referring, this is probably what that is referring to, because that would line up with about where Jesus would be traveling through. But the reference to this here is that in verse 12, the more important reference in verse 12 is that, "Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it from himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?" This is a Samaritan woman who speaks of their ancestor Jacob. The Samaritans, when the Israelites had gone off to exile and they came back, had intermarried. And because of this, the Jews had split them off and said, "You can't worship with us in the temple anymore because you're no longer a pure blood descent from Abraham." And the Jews tell them that they can't be a part of this blessing anymore. Jesus comes into this scenario, just like he did in others, and says, that's not what this is about. This is about the situation where you are going to come, and that there's going to come a time when those who worship in spirit will worship in spirit and in truth. And he tells them that, based off of her assumption, are you greater than our ancestor Jacob? He doesn't come out straight and answer that. He comes and tells them how they need to be worshiping. That it's about spirit and truth. It's about how are you going to come into this relationship with me. It does not, while he doesn't come out and say that, he implies, yes, I am greater than the patriarchs. The patriarchs set that foundation for the Israelite faith. They set a foundation for this. But I was there at the beginning. And because of this, I can tell you how you're supposed to worship. And I can tell you this is what you are going to be doing in the future. And this is the blessing that you are going to be receiving because of me. That it wasn't just about the water that was coming out of the well. It was about the living water. And that if you receive the living water, then you are going to be able to be blessed more than you could ever imagine. He says that it's a comparison between that gift that the Samaritan woman thought she was giving to him versus the living water, and that the gifts of Jacob were nothing in comparison to what Jesus was going to bless her and this city with. Let's turn over to John chapter 7 as our next reference. This is the healing of a sick man on the Sabbath. Back in John chapter 5, there was a man that was sitting by the pool, and he had been paralyzed from an early age, and he'd been left there because he thought that if he could just make the mythology was that the first person that could make it into the pool, whenever you were if you were sick, whenever the waters got stirred, that if you were the first one to make it into the pool, then you would be healed. And being a lame man and nobody to help him into it, he could never make it in there. And so he lived his life there by this pool. Jesus comes to him and has compassion upon him. He asks him, "Do you want to get well?" And the guy gives that excuse. "I don't have anybody to take me in." Doesn't answer Jesus' question directly. But here in this statement, Jesus just tells him, "Stand up, take up your mat, and walk." Well, the Jewish leaders were standing there watching. They had problems with this. The problem being was, this is the Sabbath. And on the Sabbath, you can't carry anything. You can't carry your mat. They didn't care that a guy had been lame for decades, couldn't walk, and all of a sudden he's able to not just walk, he's able to carry his own materials out of this and leave this pool area where these people were desperate for this, for a miracle. And he comes and Jesus gives them this miracle. But because it's on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders have a problem. And they question this man. Why were you doing this? Well, it's because this guy who just healed me told me to. I'm going to do what he told me to do. Do you want to meet him too? And they come and they want to persecute Jesus all the more because of it. But in John chapter 7, they confront Jesus. They finally catch up with Jesus about this man that they'd healed back in John chapter 5. And in John chapter 7, beginning of verse 19, Jesus' response to them, "Has not Moses given you the law? Yet not one of you keeps the law. Why are you trying to kill me?" In verse 20, "You are demon-possessed," the crowd answers. "Who is trying to kill you?" Jesus said to them, "I did one miracle, and you are all amazed. Yet because Moses gave you circumcision, though actually it did not come from Moses but from the patriarchs, you circumcise a boy on the Sabbath. Now, if a boy can be circumcised on the Sabbath so that the law of Moses may not be broken, why are you angry with me for healing a man's whole body on the Sabbath? Stop judging by mere appearances, but instead judge correctly." Jesus defends his healing of that sick man on the Sabbath by making a reference back to circumcision. He says, he makes a legal argument called a minoria ad maius. It's basically that if this smaller thing works, then the bigger thing should work also, from a smaller scale argument to the larger one. He says that if you can do circumcision on the Sabbath because that was the law, then why aren't you worried about the healing of this whole man, of this man becoming whole? And he says that this isn't even just a law. This was a tradition handed down from Abraham himself, from the patriarchs. That this began back in Genesis chapter 17. And he specifically mentions this isn't just what Moses told you to do. You're following this because you learned of this back in Genesis chapter 17. He calls it just the patriarchs, though. And he says that you're worried about those minutiae things. You're worried about what constitutes work on the Sabbath. You're worried about these traditions that you hold. But he says the more important thing is not this, because if I can keep circumcision, and that's something that I can do even on the Sabbath, isn't that more work? Wouldn't that be considered work? But if I have to do that on the 8th day because a boy was born on a Friday and the 8th day falls on the Sabbath, then shouldn't I be able to make this man whole also? Because isn't this man being whole? When I had the opportunity, I saw him and I had compassion on him on this day. Isn't that more important than having than these tradition of circumcision? Why can't you hold off circumcision one more day to day number 9? If you can't do that, then why do I have to hold off on healing this man? He notes that this was what his mission was about. He tells them that what he is about as he came to this world, it was to, as he said in John chapter 4 with the Samaritan woman, that it was to bring living water. And then here in John chapter 7, it's about making men whole. God has been in the business of the relationships with man and making that relationship whole since the beginning. In Genesis chapter 1, God forms man from the dust of the ground, and he saw it was very good. The rest of the creation was good, but when he formed man, it was very good. In Genesis chapter 2, he saw that it was not good for man to be alone, and he created a helpmeet for him. In Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve were hiding because of their sin, he asks, "Where are you?" Not because he didn't know their physical location, but because he was concerned for their relationship with him. He wanted to make them whole. He wanted to find a way to make their relationship whole. He wanted them to remain whole from the beginning. But when they decided to go off course, when they decided to partake of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he wanted to make them whole again. He says, "Where are you?" And then in Genesis chapter 4, he warns Cain before his sin. He sees that he's starting to go down a path. And he warns him that sin is crouching at his door. Before he murders his brother, he wants Cain to be made whole. In Genesis chapter 12, he resets the relationship by focusing instead on a single family line as a model relationship. He hones that down to Abraham, then to Isaac, and then Jacob and their family. And then throughout the rest of Genesis, we see how God focuses on the regeneration of the blessing of the line of Abraham, and how the blessing of Abraham blesses the whole world. Whether it's through Abraham's foreign relations, we see him constantly interacting with other kings in the area, and how does that happen? But then finally through Joseph, how he blesses the entire world because of his wisdom that's granted to him through God. God is in that restorative business. He's in the restorative business with this man at the pool. He's in the restorative business in our lives today. And he's demonstrated that from the beginning. His relationship with us, he wants to restore us back to him. John, as the apostle of love, I thought that was kind of ironic here on Valentine's Day weekend that we made it to John, known as the apostle whom Jesus loved. But he's known as the apostle of love because he constantly preaches on that. But love is demonstrated in Jesus Christ. Love is demonstrated in Jesus Christ because of that restoration of the relationship with God. That is how true love was demonstrated. True love was demonstrated on the cross, that he was willing to lay down his life for us. But that relationship, that true love was started back in the garden. He knew it then. He knew it as he watched Adam and Eve take that bite of the fruit, and that God foretold that the serpent would be crushed. The plan was set in place back in Genesis chapter 3. and was from the beginning of time. Next situation that we're going to look at, next allusion that we're going to look at is in John chapter 1. If you want to turn over there, the calling of Nathanael. John chapter 1, verses 45 through 51. John narrates the calling of Nathanael. He calls both Philip and Nathanael. Beginning in verse 43, I'm going to back up just a little bit from that. In verse 43, he says, "The next day Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, he said to him, 'Follow me.' Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. Philip found Nathanael and told him, 'We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph.' 'Nazareth, can anything good come from there?' Nathanael asked. 'Come and see,' said Philip. When Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said of him, 'Here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit.' 'How do you know me?' Nathanael asked. Jesus answered, 'I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip even called you.' Then Nathanael declared, 'Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel.' In verse 50, Jesus said, 'You believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree. You will see greater things than that.' He then added, 'Very truly, I tell you, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man.' Philip, the brother of Nathanael, puts him in contact with Jesus, who then demonstrates his omniscience in the presence of converting Nathanael to follow him. He comes and he brings him to Jesus, because this is the man we've been waiting for. We've been waiting for this for hundreds of years, and we've been waiting for it all of our lives. Nathanael, come with me. You've got to see him. Nathanael was sitting there underneath the tree, and Jesus says, 'I saw you back over there. I knew that you were sitting underneath that tree and that you were concerned at that time. You're coming to me now. And I'm going to tell you, I saw you over there, and I know you. And I know that you don't have guile upon you. You don't have that evil bone in your body.' And Nathanael, because of this statement of Jesus, believes. That's all it took for him to believe. It didn't take some grand miracle, some healing, some pulling fish from a massive catch of fish from the ocean. All it took was this statement of omniscience from Jesus, saying that he knew exactly what Nathanael was going through. But then he confesses that Jesus is the Son of God and he's the King of Israel. But when he does this, Jesus says, "You are going to see even greater things than this." This was nothing in comparison to what you're going to see over these next few years, and what you're going to see at the resurrection, and what you're going to see as you become my apostle to the nations. The scene ends with John narrating this one last phrase in verse 51. "Very truly I tell you, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." And some translators, there's some things that some translators take a little bit of liberty with there. That this was the word "on" could also be translated as "upon." So are they ascending and descending upon the Son of Man, or are they on the Son of Man? The NIV translate this as "on the Son of Man." And I think that's the more accurate translation, because when we see this in Genesis, this is a reference back to Genesis chapter 28. If you go back with me to Genesis chapter 28, we're going to read a few verses there. Beginning of verse 10, this is Jacob's dream. The angels ascending and descending on that ladder as Jacob was laying there and dreaming about, and God's telling him he's going to take care of him and protect him as he's going on his journey to Haran. Beginning in verse 10, Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth, with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. Verse 15, I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Verse 16, when Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. This is a dream for Jacob where God appears to him. He makes him a promise and assures him of his presence. The dream begins in verse 12 with Jacob seeing that ladder. Its bottom of the ladder is on the earth and its top reaches to heaven. The angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There's a couple of things with this that are unusual when you take it and analyze this just a little bit. And Jesus makes it more clear when he specifically references this here in the Gospel of John. He said, first thing is that notice that the angels are both ascending and descending. Now, let's think about this for just a moment. If the angels were in heaven, which would they do first? Would they descend or ascend? They would descend first and ascend. And so you might think, well, this is just a reference to, and the Hebrew sometimes does things in a different order. But the Greek doesn't. When Jesus talks about this in Aramaic, and John puts it down in Greek, he specifically uses the exact same order. He says that they were both ascending and descending, which means, what were they doing first? They were ascending. They were going up the ladder first and then coming back down the ladder. Well, this is important for a couple of reasons. One, it shows that where were the angels? The angels were with Jacob. They were taking care of him in Genesis 28. They were with Jacob, and they were protecting him at the time. They were making trips up to heaven and coming back. They were ascending and descending. This was a debate for a long time with rabbis in the rabbinic literature. And when Jesus comes, he satisfies this by saying that was the intent for what was saying it. He said that they were ascending and descending, and that this was through the Son of Man. And Nathanael will see them ascending and descending. And he uses the phrase, though it's upon the Son of Man. In Genesis 28, it was for protection of Jacob. Here in John chapter 1, he now says that you're going to see this happen. You're going to see these spiritual forces that Jacob saw back in Genesis 28. You're going to see these spiritual forces. But here's the important part. Was this a situation where they were actually seeing them? No, this was Jesus' interpretation of this. He was seeing the unseen for Nathanael. Just like he saw him afar off sitting underneath a fig tree, Jesus saw in the spiritual realm. He saw that that these angels that were coming forth, that were going out to the four corners of the earth, to the north, the south, the east, and the west, that they were upon him, that these spiritual forces were in this ministry that he was in, and they were acting on his behalf. We see them at the end of just after he was baptized, that the angels came and attended to him. The other Gospels mention that. But Jesus specifically mentions it here, saying that these angels, they're ascending and descending. Now, there's also something that's a little bit ambiguous in the Hebrew that it says on it in Genesis 28. That says that the angels were ascending and descending on it. And when you read that in Genesis, you think that's probably the latter. That was what they were ascending and descending on. But Jesus clarifies it here when he says that they are on the Son of Man, signifying that Jesus was that ladder. Jesus was that ladder back in Genesis 28. He's the pathway from heaven to earth. He's our pathway from heaven to earth, because without his blood, we have no redemption. His blood is what redeems us, but his intercession on our behalf is what takes our prayers to heaven. So he says specifically, in Jacob's case, they were attending to him and keeping him safe on his journey. But in Jesus' case, they were attending to Jesus and the spreading of the gospel here. But Jesus was the presence of God on earth. He was the one that was from the beginning, and he was the one there, and in Genesis chapter 28, that it says it was on the Son of Man. That ambiguity in the Hebrew was clarified later on when Jesus specifically tells them that here's what they were descending on. They were descending on the Son of Man. Finally, it's important to note that the title given to Jesus in this verse, as the Son of Man, Jesus is characterized by both his heavenly origin and his destination. You can see Daniel for more on this title, the Son of Man. But it is given to the one who has divine prerogatives for giving both life, for judging, and for the forgiveness of sins. And that Jesus is greater than Jacob. This is what we talked about a moment ago with the Samaritan woman. But here in John chapter 1, it says that it's noting that Jesus is greater than Jacob because he is the true house of God there at the end of Genesis 28. And he is the gate of heaven in verse 17. So let's keep going. Because here's the most obvious one from John, the most obvious allusion to Genesis is the first words. The first clause of Genesis says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And this is an obvious allusion that John isn't trying to hide at all to the first clause of Genesis, where it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." There are several signals that John is pointing back to Genesis. This unique combination of words, there's several times that this phrase "in the beginning" is used. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all use the phrase "in the beginning." But here's where John is definitely pointing back to "in the beginning," referring back to creation, not just in the beginning of Jesus' ministry. John specifically says it again in verse 2. He says, "He was with God in the beginning." He's emphasizing it and showing that I didn't just turn this as a phrase talking about in the beginning of a specific event. I'm talking about in the beginning. because he was with God in the beginning, for emphasis. But it's also not even just that combination of words, because the Greek phrase arche refers to in Strong's as it's absolutely or the beginning of all things, for this specific definition of it. It's the beginning of all. And the fact that it's used at the very opening of the book and the opening sentence of the opening book and the opening phrase of the opening sentence of the book, it ties it uniquely to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, without John having to cite it. Unlike Matthew will attribute the prophets say this, the patriarchs say this. He'll give those specific quotations. John doesn't write in that style. He writes in the style where he wants you to get it. He wants you to understand it because he's writing to a group of Christians. He's writing to a group of Christians who are struggling with their faith at the time. He's not trying to convert you from Judaism to Christianity. They were already in that place for his primary audience. The book of John was written to early Christians who were struggling with, why should I believe this? Why should I not fall back into my Judaism? Why should I continue in this path of Christianity? Why should I believe that Jesus was truly God and truly human? And so when you take those into light, he's giving us this reference to that Jesus is truly divine. He is greater than Jacob. We've talked about that already. He was greater than the patriarchs. He's greater than the festivals, such as Sabbath and the circumcision. He's greater than all those things that we saw earlier. But it's because he is truly divine. He was there at the creation. Because he was there at the creation, I know that he is the great I am. There are 7 times that he even uses that phrase in the book of John, but that was more for a little bit later audience. That was coming from Exodus when he defines himself as I am who I am. But he comes and he tells them that he was that I am that Moses wrote about. That I am the bread of life. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the gate. He gives 7 different times where he talks about the I am, but he's showing that the intent is this is the new covenant. Just like the old covenant started with in the beginning, this new covenant is starting with in the beginning again. This parallel to the creation story tells us clearly of the role of Christ in the creation, and how this new covenant will be focused on this one central figure, just like the old covenant was. The old covenant was focused on sacrifices and the law, but they were all just shadows of what was to come in the New Testament. John ties in the word spoken in Genesis and the word in John, they're the same. He said that when God creates, he speaks and it happens. Well, he spoke the word, and John says Jesus was that word. Jesus was the Word in the beginning, not just the words of our text that we have in front of us. He is the Word that God uses to speak. He says that at day one is not creation, but at some time before creation is actually the beginning, because that's when Jesus was with God. He was there before the creation of the world. In the beginning is beginning with Jesus. Because in verse 3, through him, all things are made. He parallels creation also by showing the necessity of light here in John chapter 1, and how this was the first creation of God. When light is this important, was that important in Genesis chapter 1, it's even more important in John chapter 1. Because without light, we can't see where the darkness truly is. The darkness of this world, though, is not the physical darkness that God took care of in Genesis chapter 1. It's the spiritual darkness. And how will we address those spiritual topics today? Not the primeval chaos of Genesis chapter 1, but those that are opposed to God. A couple of other minor allusions that John makes here. That in John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, there's a similar phraseology to when Mary tells the servants in verse 5, do whatever he tells you. That's reminiscent of the authority that Pharaoh gives to Joseph. The only difference is that when Pharaoh bestows upon Joseph, it's because of his demonstration of wisdom. But Mary says, Jesus already is in charge of all these things. You just need to listen to him. Just like we tell others, listen to him. What are you going to do in your own life? Are you willing to listen to him? Are you willing to do whatever he tells you? And then in in John chapter 8, verses 42 through 47, there's also an allusion to Genesis 3 through 4, where it talks about in verse 44, you belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. And this is made more clear when he talks about this in 1 John chapter 3, verse 12. He says, do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous. John shows that the slippery slope of sin is just like it was in Genesis. Sin hasn't changed since we think that there's something new under the sun. Ecclesiastes tells us there's nothing new under the sun. The same sins that were around in Genesis chapter 3 are still here today. We have that slippery slope. Man thinks that they keep inventing new things and ways to sin, but it was there from the beginning. They couldn't come up with anything new that because it's all about that rebellion towards God. He also refers to in that chapter that Abraham, it's not about your descent from Abraham. It's about doing what Jesus is telling them to do. Here in John chapter 8, he continues to define, just as Luke did, that it's not about that individual genealogy that comes from the line of Jacob. It's about, are you willing to do what God is telling you to do? He says in verse 31, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. They try to claim genealogy, but Jesus tells them, if you are Abraham's children, in verse 39, then you would do what Abraham did. And that's have faith and trust in God. Same lessons that we're told in Genesis. Are you willing to obey God even in those hard circumstances? Are you willing to trust in him even in the midst of trials? Are you willing to pave that path and willing to trust him? Genesis and the writings of John demonstrate the parallelism between the deity of God and how Jesus fulfills those same characteristics. The theme of Abraham's importance continues to be that major of how his faith is important in our life today. It continues to be a major theme throughout the New Testament, and we're going to see that even more next week. Next week, we're going to be taking a look at some of the letters of Paul. We're going to take 2 weeks to look at all the Pauline letters. We're going to look at some of his early writings next week. So that'd be 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians. So that's a lot of book if you're reading along with me. But Paul has that important characteristic of how he trusts and what reference he puts in the book of Genesis, and how we're going to see how is that used to give us the foundation for our faith according to Paul. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day worshiping.